Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wild Neighbors Speaker Series. We're really happy to have you here today. We have a very special speaker, Jim O'Donnell, with the City of Austin Wildlands Conservation Division. He works with Balcones Canyonlands Preserve on many things, but especially the Vireo Preserve habitat restoration that we're going to be hearing all about today. And he is a forest ecosystem biologist. Before we get started, I just want to introduce myself. I'm Johanna Arendt with Travis County Natural Resources. Travis County co-manages the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve with the City of Austin and a number of other private and public partners. Today, we are going to have Jaya Torres with City of Austin facilitating the Q&A. So we'll have a live Q&A with Jim at the end. And if you have questions for him, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom. And I think that's all we need to cover to begin with here. So let me stop sharing my screen and invite Jim to share his.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yay, all right. Great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today for the Wild Neighbors series. This has been a great series. I tune in all the time for this, and thanks to the county for hosting. And so let's go ahead and get started. The topic today is reforesting degraded landscapes. And let's get started here. The Balcones Canyonlands Preserves operate under a federal endangered species permit and a habitat conservation plan. And our habitat conservation plan, it's very long, it's a notebook, it's 4 inches thick, but for the purposes of this presentation, let's just talk about some of the highlights. We need to, according to the habitat conservation plan, we needed to set aside 30,428 acres in Western Travis County, must be protected and managed as endangered species habitat. At least 2,000 of that must be managed to protect existing and create additional black-capped vireo habitat. And the focus there is not on current, is not on currently suitable habitat for vireos or warblers. And the remaining 28,000 acres or so must be managed to protect existing and restore additional golden cheek warbler habitat. The endangered species and rare species that we focus on the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve are the golden cheek warbler. We have prime habitat here in Western Travis County for that songbird. The black-capped vireo was just recently delisted, but we still protect its habitat and manage its habitat. We also have 6 karst or cave invertebrates that we protect, and we have a lot of karst type features in caves in Western Travis County. We have species of concern. We have 25 karst species that live in caves that are species of concern, and we want to protect those. And we have 2 plant species. The eastern edge of the Edwards Plateau was historically heavily wooded and fairly diverse. This picture here is taken by William Bray in 1904, and he describes how lush the soil was and how dense the forest was. This was taken not very far from the Vireo Preserve, for those of you who know where that is, and he turned his camera and to an area that had been clear cut. Clear cutting began in the Austin area in Western Travis County beginning in the late 1850s or so, and was accelerated when the railroad came to Austin in the 1870s. Large numbers of juniper were cut across the hills, and we're the flash flood capital of the world, right? So you cut all the vegetation off these hills and you lose your topsoil. And that's the problem we're dealing with today. In addition to the clear cutting of that time period, we also had rapid development happening and beginning in the 1980s in Western Travis County, continuing today. And these maps are courtesy of Travis County, who made these wonderful maps. So in 1996, when we got the permit for the preserve system, this is what development looked like. The preserves are in green here, and the development at that time period is in yellow. By 2006, you can see the increase of the yellow development around these preserves. And by 2016, you can see it's basically on all of our borders. The idea and the reason I'm showing this is the land we have is the land we're going to have. So there's nothing that we can toss away and say, oh, we've got more acreage to deal with. We have a little over 30,000 acres of preserved land for endangered species in Western Travis County, and every acre is important. So it's important that land that is not for habitat, for much of anything, that we restore that habitat. So when we're looking at our forests and woodlands, we're looking at different types of habitat. Some of our habitat is prime habitat. It's beautiful. The Balcones Canyonlands Preserve is truly a gift for the citizens of Austin. It's a beautiful, it's nice to be able to protect that land. I grew up in the area and hiked on it as a kid, and it's just wonderful to be able to participate in its protection and restoration. So protecting, like this tree that you see, this juniper tree, with this young lady here, that tree is probably over 250 years old. And so that's our prime habitat. And then we also have areas in our preserve that we call them enhancing. They're areas that we're trying to recover slowly. They're mainly recovering on their own. And then we have areas that are just degraded that we need to work with. So here's some photographs of that. The first one here on the left is our prime habitat. In those areas, we control for invasive species. We maybe do some seeding in those areas, and we monitor those areas. We're not heavily active in restoration in those areas unless there's some erosion issues. The middle picture here is a recovering area. This area was probably, in this case here, was burned in early 1960s in a fire that was human caused, and it is recovering nicely on its own. We do plant down in the area, and we do a lot of seeding that just add diversity into that system. And then on the far right here is some of the habitat, or actually it's not habitat, it's degraded landscapes that are actually degrading every year and getting worse. You can see just by looking at that photograph, you can see the sheet erosion that comes across every time that it rains. So when we look at landscapes and we start to figure out, okay, so what are we going to do with this? We do a series of assessments. We assess the soil condition or lack of soil. In this case, that's subsoil. We look at the compaction, the soil structure, the soil depth, how it drains, erosion issues, soil organic matter. We assess species diversity. In this particular tract that I'm working on, there's really only 2 major woody plants, and that's live oak and juniper, and a smattering of other things, but really the species diversity of woody plants here is like 5. So it's very low in that area. We also assess the amount and accumulation of biomass, how much biomass we have in the area. We look at slope and aspect, especially for planting. The western slopes are going to be harsher to plant on than a northern slope. We research the land use history, which is fascinating, especially on this track here, to find out what was done in the past without incurring any blame or anything. It is what it is, and so now it's ours to deal with. And then we design and map out a recovery plan. So how did it get that way? Well, it's clear cutting, burning, biocides, overgrazing, all the usual suspects. Nothing unique about the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve. This is being done all over Central Texas. Soil erosion is a big issue in these degraded areas. It takes about 100 to 500 years to build an inch of soil, depending on the geology and the availability of organic matter. We're able to build it faster by adding organic matter to the system, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. But I think about this sometimes when I'm driving in the hill country, that one afternoon of poor land management decisions can result in a setback of hundreds of years. And I've talked with many land owners and land managers who have cleared hillsides with the idea that it was just all going to pop up in the grass. and they just end up with an eroded hillside. Okay, so how do we rebuild soils? You know, when we're talking reforestation, it's much more than just planting trees. The first thing we have to look at is the soil. And so how do we build this into a carbon sponge and restore degraded landscapes? You know, if you look at that, this is Caliche here. And so it's subsoil, the topsoil has been washed off, and this is hard compacted stuff. I guarantee you, because we've done it, if you dig into this, you plant an oak tree and you walk away, maybe you water it a few times, it's not going to survive in this habitat. So we really need to focus on soil and soil biology before we start planting. So here's like a little demonstration that kind of illustrates some of the issues that we deal with here in the hill country. So this is kind of a water flower demonstration. And if you get flour, you put it in a pie dish and you pour water on it. What it's going to do is it's going to pool up and then it's going to run off. It's not going to soak in, because when you have compaction, there's no airspace, there's no water can't get into it, and the roots can't get into it. When you have reduced plant cover, you have high albedo in these areas that are just compacted soil and heat. You have that pooling type stuff, so the water pools, it doesn't soak in, and it washes off, causing erosion. So we have runoff erosion, we lose our topsoil, sediments and biocides, rills and head cuts develop. And then on top of that, there's wind erosion. So all of that is what we're experiencing on some of our degraded landscapes. And this is kind of what that looks like. You know, you pour water on top of this and it just runs. The soil temperature in those areas is also really high. I did this at the Biodiversity Preserve on one of our Caliche slopes, and it was 104 degrees out that day. And I put the thermometer into the soil there, and it was 120 degrees. We've gotten it up as high as 130 degrees in other locations, but just literally, you know, 15, 20 feet away where there was a woodland canopy, it was 87 degrees. So this is what that caliche looks like when you dig it up a little bit. It's like a powder, it's like that flour, and you can literally just blow that away. And there's no structure there, there's no moisture in that soil. It's pretty much dead. There may be some anaerobic bacteria that live in that, but there's not a whole lot of life in that soil or subsoil. Now, if you have a porous soil, and that water can infiltrate into the system, you have a porous space, and the porous spaces are made by bacteria and fungus that actually bind and tie and glue particles together to allow space in the soil. So porous space, soil aggregates are held together by carbon glues from bacteria and fungus. A healthy soil is 66% space. So 66% space, that's a lot of space that compacted soils just simply, you know, don't have any water in. So we have moisture retention in that. So as water is running across the landscape, instead of just a sheet erosion of washing across, it actually soaks into, soaks into the soil. Water and nutrients are held in these spaces. So that 66% space is room for water and nutrients. The downward movement, water and nutrients move deep into the soil and go down where we would have a root system. And if there's enough water and it continues to go down, it hits a hard pan sometimes of rock, and that downward movement of moisture hits a solid and can then come out as a spring. So the importance of soil, the carbon sponge there, is it captures and stores more rainfall. You know, we're talking about with climate change, kind of extreme conditions of both drought and heavy rain. And if we have a landscape, especially in our hill country here, where we have a lot of runoff heading down the hill fast, we have flooding issues. If we improve our soil, that can capture some of that water and hold that water, then we reduce our flooding issues. So it's less vulnerable to erosion and more resistant to drought. So if we hold that water in the soil, instead of having it wash off, we're going to be less susceptible to drought conditions. And it also stores nutrients and increases the fertility of the soil. This picture here is in a juniper oak woodland. Notice the soil underneath the juniper tree, that it's in a forest soil there. Okay, plants and soil diversity, starting getting into the plant part of this. The soil food web is really important that we develop the soil food web. What happens is, you know, the photosynthesis hits the plants, creates carbon sugar that goes down into the root system, which attracts bacteria and fungus right to the root zone there. Now, they're feeding on those exudates, and we'll talk about exudates in a second, which is carbon sugars, and they are full of nutrients. Fungus and bacteria just literally get fat with nutrients. Well, anytime there's something like that, there's always going to be predators that attracts beneficial nematodes, and protozoa are attracted to that root zone. They eat the fungus, they eat the bacteria, and in their droppings, they release those nutrients right there at the root zone, and that's what gives the plant fertility. So plant exudates, and this is actually a picture of one, of a root system, you know, releasing some exudate. And so plants release about 30 to 40% of their carbon in the form of exudates from their roots. So 30, you know, the carbon that plants are using, some of it's for growth, and 30 to 40% of it is carbon that's released to attract bacteria and fungus. So exudates are sugars, carbon and protein. Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is a soil scientist, refers to it as cookies for the soil. And exudates attract and feed bacteria and fungus, as we talked about. Bacteria and fungus bring nutrients into the rhizosphere. So that's where the nutrients are. And if a plant is, this is what's fascinating to me, if a plant is lacking a certain nutrient, and there's 42 of them that a plant needs, it will send enzymes to instruct bacteria and fungus to bring that nutrient back. So they're able to direct, plants are able to direct a bacteria and fungus to get nutrients for them. So it's really important that we have healthy soils and we're not putting things into the soil that disrupt that system. Density dependent behavior, or coordinated behavior, is a fascinating thing that Christine Jones, a soil scientist from Australia, writes and talks a lot about. And she talks about the biodiversity of plants provide a diversity of exudates, which provide a diversity of microorganisms. So each plant has a variety of these exudates that they send out, which, you know, which attracts a diversity of microbes. Dr. Elaine Ingham again talks about, so how many of these microbes have actually been described down to the species level? And she says about 1%. You know, we don't have a lot of, you know, it's kind of a new frontier. So what they're looking at mainly is not trying to necessarily bring it down to the species level, but what is the function of these microbes and how do they function in the environment? Each species of bacteria and fungus produce its own chemical signal. These are called autoinducers. So once there is a sufficient concentration of microbes, once that plant can bring all of those microbes to its root system through different types of exudates, they have a quorum and can change the gene expression. Our bodies kind of do the same thing. We can change genes with certain nutrients and things in our gut. The result can be improved growth, drought resistance, and soil improvement. So if you're in a system that has poor diversity, you don't have enough microorganisms to have what they call a quorum, just like in a city council or any type of meeting. Everybody brings their particular talents to a group and then you have a quorum to make a decision. There is also that in the soil where if you have a large diversity of microorganisms, they can really change the expression of plants across the landscape. And if you look at this picture here, this is one of the areas that is in transition. It's got oak trees in here and a lot of frostweed and a lot of nice understory plants, and is developing the soil life. One of the real important things as we add diversity back into the system, that we pay real close attention to the types of plants and the species that we're putting into the ground. When I start restoration work, especially in these really degraded areas, I'm using a lot of pretty hardy plants that can survive in a poor soil, legume type species, flame leaf sumacs, just kind of tough plants. But as that soil improves, I'm going to be putting in things that are host plants for pollinators on a larger scale. So, for example, oak trees, and that's over here on your right, and the escarpment cherry, probably host more beneficial caterpillars and than any other tree in our woodlands. So if you want to, I think oak trees, just nationally, I think they've recorded well over 500 species of butterflies and moths that use oak trees for host plants. Cherries are a close second, around 300 or 400. So both of those are important trees in our habitat. But some of the more local guys here, like for example, the one in the middle here with the white flowers, that's kidney wood, and that's the host plant for dog-faced butterflies. So if you want that in your yard or your preserve, you need to plant a diversity of woody plants. The one down on the lower left-hand side there, with the three leaflets there, that is wafer ash, and wafer ash is an understory forest plant that we use a lot. It's in the citrus family, and it's the host plant for tiger swallowtails and giant swallowtail butterflies. So we want that in our preserve system, so we plant a lot of that as well. If you're interested in learning more about pollinators and the types of plants they use, I'd recommend Dr. Doug Caliche. He's an entomologist, University of Delaware, and he does research on the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of the animal community. So again, we want our preserves to come alive. One of the things that I see when I go into these degraded areas is it's quiet. It's hard to find life. I was out on one site for 8 hours and a raven flew over at one point, and that's really basically the only bird that I saw out there that day. And I go into other areas that are better habitat or areas that have been restored, and there's birds singing all day long. So it's quite a change and quite a difference. One of the things that we're beginning to research on our preserve system is mycorrhizal fungus and its connection to other trees and how it benefits our habitat. Mycorrhizal fungus has gotten a lot of attention through Dr. Suzanne Simard's books, and she was kind of the first to make that connection between trees sharing mycorrhizal messaging and connections and how that benefits the forest community. Mycorrhizal fungus well, I should probably tell you what it is before I get too far into this. Mycorrhizal fungus is a fungus that forms mutual symbiotic association with plant roots. And there's a picture there, and a large picture of little strands. That's the mycorrhizal fungus attached to the roots. And they act like little fingers, long fingers, going out into the system and collecting nutrients and bringing back those nutrients to the plant. They also share nutrients with other nearby plants and communicate things like danger. If there's a drought or stress or insect infestation, there's chemical signals that are sent via the mycorrhizal fungus. So mycorrhizal fungus increases the uptake of nutrients and water, protects plants from disease, builds soil structure, improves the growth rate, and sends communication signals to other plants. And there's about 90% of the plants on Earth have mycorrhizal connections. We are working with a couple of former students of Dr. Suzanne Simard on this question of how mycorrhizal connections benefit our woodlands and the connection between junipers and oaks and our juniper oak woodlands. we're also working with a researcher from Arizona just recently here, again, looking at the benefits of mycorrhizal and how we can use that in restoration work. And under mycorrhizal, there's two different types that we deal with here on the preserves. There's the arbuscular AMF, and there's the ectomycorrhizal EMF. And juniper tends to be arbuscular mycorrhizal. And what's really interesting about arbuscular mycorrhizal is they produce the glomalin with the glues. So in the soil, it helped to bind particles together and create that airspace. And that was just recently discovered in 1996 by Sarah Wright of the USDA. So a lot of this is new stuff coming out, and we're just fascinated to learn more about it. And ectomycorrhizae, they're the ones that when you see mushrooms popping up, not all mushrooms are mycorrhizal, but they reproduce using mushrooms. So when you start to see a lot of mushrooms in that forest floor, you can pretty much bet the mycorrhizal community is healthy. And so a little picture of what it looks like. You got a mushroom, and then you've got all these connections to mycorrhizal fungus with plant roots. Okay, so some techniques for building soil, just to kind of sum this up a little bit. The first thing is we want to protect existing woodlands and forests because they have that bank of nutrients and mycorrhizal fungus and good soil, and we want to protect what we have. Ramial wood is basically just branches from deciduous plants. I use it basically to feed the fungus, right? So I'll cut some of that, and it's usually things like yopon, things that are fairly aggressive that grow back quick. I'll cut the branches sometimes on those, and Baccharis is another one that's pretty aggressive, and I use Baccharis for mulch. I don't kill the whole plant, I'll just take from it for mulch and ramial wood. And it's just, you cut it into small pieces. It'd be great to chip it, but I don't have a chipper handy all the time. But I cut it into small pieces and use it and just leave it on the forest floor there. Sheet mulching and compost, we'll be talking about quite a bit when I show how we do some of this work. Sheet mulching is basically adding a layer of compost, adding leaves, compost leaves, and you're basically building a humus type topsoil. And we want a high diversity of fauna and appropriate plant cover. So as we increase diversity in these systems, we also increase animals. And as we increase the animals, they increase, their droppings for things like nitrogen and carbon ratios. We need something to help break down some of that carbon, and animals play an important role in that. And also appropriate plant cover where it needs to be. For example, we want to make sure that, in a sunny location, we've got a plant out there that can deal with a harsh environment and not have a forest plant out there. We seed. I think every time I go out on a hike or something, I've always got a pocket full of seeds that I've collected and put out. We do a lot of planting. Right now is tree planting seasons. Basically from October until March is tree planting time. And I think on one of our sites, we have over 500 trees planted so far. So we're hoping that, with COVID subsides a little bit, we can get more people out to help plant trees. We protect young vegetation. One of the things that we want to be real careful about is we're out there trying to help things that we're not stepping on vegetation, little trees that are coming up. So I always make sure that we're kind of in a single file path as we go down to make sure that we're not doing any damage by stepping on trees or compacting the soil more. And no exposed ground. Anytime there's bare caliche, we do our best to try to cover that up to keep that from just being a little heat island or a compaction zone or erosion area. So minimal disturbance of the soil and compaction issues. When we have to, like with caliche, I can't just seed on caliche because it would just wash away. One of the things I do is I'll go in with a pick, a group of us will go in with a pick, and we're not tilling the soil, we're just opening the soil. throw some organic matter in there like compost, and then we'll seed that area and then put a light mulch over it, and we get pretty good seed germination from that. And then of course protecting our soils from erosion. Okay, so a couple of examples of what we've done with restoration work. This is at the Vireo Preserve, and for years and years, I mean, I've been out there since the I guess early 1980s. We always call this area the dead zone because since 1940, you look on a map and it's just like this dead zone. It's just Caliche. So 1940 is our earliest aerial photographs, and so it could have been, you know, even 20 or 30 years before that. You know, it could have still been Caliche. So well over 100 years of just not coming back on its own. Sometimes people will say, well, everything comes back on its own. Well, it doesn't. Sometimes the train's just knocked off the track, and you've got to give nature, you know, Mother Nature a little helping hand, just enough to kind of get her started again, and then let it take off. This is an example of where you see these guys standing on the Caliche. That's what that whole area looked like. We've gone in here, and this was not, you know, we put some mulch down, and I'll explain what we did here. So, wrong way there. Okay, so this is that same area 2 years later. What we did is we put in small bioswales or berm and swales. We're directing the water off of the road into the system. So the water, instead of just running down the road, was redirected into that little system. And then we sheet mulched the area. Sheet mulching, again, is putting compost and organic matter and layering it up and keeping it pretty moist, or at least starting it moist. And then we plant and seed the area. So you can see this area that was just Caliche is now the yellow flower is Lindheimer senna, which is a legume, trying to add nitrogen back into that. A lot of the grass seed did really well in there. And then once we get some cover, and here it is 3 years later, with water now in that berm and swale. We just call them bioswales as well. And so we redirected that water into that system. So now there's moisture in there, and we could seed it, and you can see the wildflowers coming up as well. And then just a few days ago, I was in there, and now we've got maybe 12 different species of woody plants that are growing in this because they have cover. And a lot of this is switchgrass because of the moisture. And the plant right in front of you there with the seed heads, that's flame leaf sumac, which has been great in there. And so here's a little live oak that's in there. And what we have found with oak planting is oaks need a little bit of cover to survive, because you can plant oaks out in the open in our system. They're going to look great, you know, in March and April and May, and they're thriving, they're putting on leaves. And then come September, they're dead because it's just too dry out there for them. They need a little bit of cover to kind of keep them going. Now, this little oak, I planted this oak in there just recently, and you can see the soil in my hand there. That's what was formerly that discard pack Caliche. And that's when I dug that hole to put this oak in. That's what the soil looks like now. So this guy will do fine. He's got a little protection because this is a west-facing slope. So he has protection from the grasses and the baccharis, and will thrive in that environment there. So when we design these areas, we're looking at, you know, basically 4 different things that need to be added quickly. First, we're thinking about, well, how do I get water into this landscape? How do I rehydrate this? A lot of these areas are hydrophobic, and the water just rushes right off, right? So sometimes it's earthwork. We have to put structures in to capture the water, spread and sink the water, and anything that we can get in there to hold that water so it just doesn't rush down the hill. Running water is a bad thing. We want that water to slowly, you know, kind of spread and sink. And then we add a lot of diversity into the system. So once we get the water situation, the earthwork put in, then we'll add tons of seeds and diversity into the system. We'll add biomass of plants and surface mulch, and then we'll well, make sure that there's organic matter in the soil to start to build that soil sponge. So we'll add compost, especially when we're planting. We don't always just spread the whole area with compost, but we will when we're seeding and planting. So this is what I call a bioswale. Other people call them contoured swales. Some people call them trenches. And there's actually a lot of debate on the names, and people kind of get really into the name of what these systems are called. We can always call it by its scientific name, which is Burmis swalei, and that just sort of covers the whole thing, right? So how this system works is, oops, oh, there we go. How this system works is, I don't know if you can see that little arrow or not, but there we go. How the system works is that there is a swale that's cut on contour, and then the soil or subsoil that's taken out of the contour is bermed up as the berm, and that's where you see the arrows there. That's the berm. Now, when it rains, water goes into the berm. It doesn't run, it sits, and it soaks into the berm on the other side, which is usually planted. And so the area just down on the side there is planted with trees and bushes and whatnot. These bioswales are tree growing systems. That's really, I mean, I guess you could do it for grass, but they're really tree growing system because the plant roots of trees help to stabilize that berm. Now, after a rain, as I said, that water just plumes into the berm and it waters the system. And once it goes down and as the soil matures and this biology gets better, the water can soak down, hit a hard pan, and then come out as a spring. So this is an area that we started at the Vireo Preserve in 2019, and you can see where the laser leveler, we have a very talented contractor who digs this for us. We tried doing it by hand, but it's hard to get return volunteers after a day of that. So anyway, now we contract this out, and he comes in with his laser leveler to make sure that it's all on contour, and he has a mini excavator, which you'll see here in a second, that actually digs it out, and he can get done in a day what would take us a month to do. So, but you can see now how degraded that soil is, and this is like in October when these grasses should be, have flowering heads and stuff. And you can just see it's pretty bad shape, pretty compacted. So this is our contractor digging the bioswale on contour. And so you can see what he's doing. He's mounding up the soil and then digging a swale. And then once the swale is and the berm is put in, we invite the public out to do a tree planting and to mulch the berm. And you can see folks here planting and mulching the swales. On areas down from the swales, we always enlarge this footprint farther out. It's never just one particular line of trees. We make this footprint of restoration as large as possible, but we're still dealing with slope and stuff, so we can use rock berms like we did here, and then seed behind it. All of our trees are caged, as you see. We have deer issues out there, and so we cage everything, and then as soon as the tree becomes taller than the cage, we take the cage off and set it free, and the deer can then nibble, but they won't take the whole plant. So this was the spring of 2020 here on the left, and so this was, we dug this in October 2019. By the spring, this is what it looked like after a rain, and you can see the water in the swale. It usually stays in for a couple of hours and it plumes into the berm, and you can see our plantings and our wildflowers out there, quite a change from what it looked like before. And then by September, you can see the amount of tree growth that we had on that same berm. You can see the oak tree in the background there, and then that was the first berm. And by September, you can see just the massive amount of growth from the rain and the pluming into the berm. And what's really interesting is down from the berm on the other side, downhill from the berm, that whole system came alive too, because that water is still kind of pluming down in there, keeping that soil moist. And this is what it looked like again without the water in it. Eventually that swale will probably be filled in with grasses. We've seeded a lot of switchgrass and stuff like that in there as well. But they do function really well. And what's great is the finches. You know, we have a lot of sunflowers and things that we also, it's a huge diversity of plants. I think we've added well over 100 probably species of plants in here, both herbaceous and woody plants. And the birds are just all over this thing in the summertime. And they're spreading seed as they land on the cages and move around the area. A larger project, this is our double J&T restoration project. This is 1,700 acres, and it's out by Lakeway. I know this map's kind of hard to read, but you can see the green property boundary lines here. And up to the top, there's a road that comes down. You see the rainwater barn, which I'll show you a picture here in a second. Where we have road access, and this is a dirt road, we can do things like build a rainwater barn, and then the little dotted lines that you see along the ridges there, those are contour lines, and that's where we put in bioswales and to capture water. We want to capture water high in the landscape so it doesn't become a flooding issue down below. And capturing water up there and revegetating up on the top of these hillsides benefits flooding, you know, that it keeps, you know, flooding from being a huge issue down slope. So it's kind of taking a liability and you know, the flooding and the rain, you know, with the sheet erosion and turning it into a liability where we can capture that water and grow trees up there and increase our habitat. So all the little dotted blue lines you can see where we're working. We have about a half a mile of farms and swales in there now, with more proposed. And the green, big green areas, these are areas where we can't really get a mini excavator in to dig a berm and swale. It would do too much damage to get into those areas and create a road to do that. So in the more remote areas, we're seeding heavily, like in one area, the area that's farthest south on this map, we seeded with 60,000 treated evergreen sumac seeds, and they're coming up beautifully. So we heavily seed these areas with treated seed. That's not, you know, we treat it. We've got a treatment technique down that we can, you know, almost guarantee germination. So it's working out really well. So when we do put these seeds in, we're careful about where we seed them. For example, flame leaf sumac and evergreen sumac, we're going to probably seed those along the a woodland patch. And on this picture, that's where there's more fungus. So if we take a look at this picture, you can look at the landscape and kind of get an idea of the soil biology, which if it's more fungal dominated or more bacterial dominated ratio. So next to a woodland or in a woodland, you have more fungal dominated soil, which is going to be more tree friendly. Out in the open, it's more bacterial dominated. And then when you have shrub, you know, also in grasslands, it's more bacterial dominated. Bacteria can break down grasses where fungus needs to break down the lignins and hardy or hardwood type stuff. And then where you have bushes and grass, there's an equal ratio sometimes of fungus and bacteria, and we'll also seed in those areas. But when we seed this stuff, I wouldn't throw it in, you know, that Caliche bacteria stuff, because one, it's probably going to wash away in that area. So we're going to pick an area that's got a little bit of cover, a little bit of protection, like on the edge of the woods there or the edge of the brush there, and sort of expand, because we're also trying to connect into that mycorrhizal connection that those woody areas have. So in those woods there's mycorrhizal fungus that are connecting all of those trees, and we want vegetation that will also eventually be able to connect into that. So here's our water barn at Double J. It's 60 by 40. So for every inch of rain, we collect 1,500 gallons in the system. Now, this system has a polyurethane hose. It's a pretty fat hose that goes down a half a mile down slope that we use for our watering our plants in the berm and swale. It's all gravity. And then when we have irrigation boxes down there, we turn on that water and it's like a garden hose just because of the half a mile that it goes downhill. And so we've got really good water pressure. So this is the area that we started to restore down there. This is kind of a before picture before we put the bioswales in. And you can see that nothing really beneficial is happening here. The juniper is doing what it can to kind of hold onto some soil and build a little bit of soil. And you can kind of see, well, I think in the next picture does it better. You can see, maybe you can see that little stump. It's like, where's Waldo? There's a little stump that you can see, and there's a little mat of juniper duff that's around that. And that's, juniper's a soil builder, and it protects plants. So oftentimes when we're planting in similar environments, we're planting under juniper here because that's where the soil is going to be, and that's where the protection is. Those are where the nutrients are, and also that's less chances of it being washed away. But out there in the open, those grasses out there really struggle to exist. So when we put a berm and swale in, we really look hard at the location to make sure that it's a good fit for that system. It's a good restoration tool for that system. In this case, we look back on the historical maps and found that it's been like this since 1940, and it's not getting any better. And we're starting to get, you can't see it in this picture, but just off the side there's head cuts and really some serious erosion issues that I've just recently got some rock and stuff to try to work on to fix. So this is a little bit down the way from that, but here's January of 2001. And our contractor cut, through there on contour. You can see the swale and then the bermed up soil. The bermed up soil, that's what we're going to plant in. This is January of 2001, and by June of 2001, same place, same area, you can see the transformation that happened there. And so we're able to collect that flooding water that was coming down that hill into a swale that goes into a berm and waters our system here. And it waters out quite far from that. And we, started planting trees. You can see that there's trees that we planted, on both sides of the swale, and continuing to plant today. As a matter of fact, I'll be out there this afternoon probably planting. So we just kind of keep that system going, and we're planting down slope from this as well. And here's another picture along the berm. Again, we just add lots of diversity into the system. And these trees will grow really fast. A year from now, this thing will just totally be covered. You won't be able to see the ground probably. We have a lot of great help, and this is Austin CCC who's come out to help us on a day, a tree planting. And the guy in the foreground there, that's Bill Stout. He's pointing down, and Bill Stout he's one of our biologists, and he gives a great presentation on how to plant trees and to make sure that, we want them in the ground, but we want them in the ground right so they'll grow well. So, and Bill gives a great presentation, but we do a lot of instruction on tree planting out there. This is a little bit farther down. So if you see February of 2016, this was years ago, we've been messing around in this area for quite a while trying to figure out what to do with it. And you can see how degraded that is, and see our little flags. I thought it'd be a good idea to put berms and swales in August of 2016. I think I was the only one who thought that was a good idea. But you can see we did this. These were some of the BCP staff who helped me dig this out. And this is, February of 2016 to August of 2016. And you can see we had a little rain in August, and we were able to capture that water into berms and swales. And that was our pilot project. And we kind of thought, whoa, this is really working out well. Let's expand this, but not in a manual labor type way, but something that would be faster and more efficient. And by the way, this is 2016. This is so wooded now that I keep trying to take a picture, and it's just going to be a picture of there's Mimosa borealis and Weisach and oaks and all sorts of stuff that have grown in here. You just see a picture of a tree. So you need to come out and see it. It's really transformed quite a bit. And so we also use other things than berms and swales. We use rock berms, and we put these on contour. So we have a lot of erosion due to tops to clear cutting and fire. On this particular site, there was a fire in '61 that took out all the vegetation, and then all the topsoil kept washing away. So we're trying to capture in this slope now any of that topsoil and seed and stuff that's still being washed down. It's a west-facing dry slope, so it's brutal there in August. So to plant something there, it has to be pretty hardy until we can get some shade and ground cover there. These rocks are on contour. It's about 3 feet wide and 1 rock high. It's why it's called a one rock bomb, and it captures and slows runoff. We also seed in between these rocks so we can get grass seed coming up, or grass coming up from the seed. And then in that area, you know, we're not going to be planting cherry trees and stuff. We're going to be planting legumes and sumacs and things like that that can take that harsh afternoon sun in the summertime. And we're starting to sheet mulch this area with organic matter. They kind of bring some of the organic matter back into the system that's long since been washed away. This is another area on the Vireo Preserve. This was an oak wilt area back in the 1980s. And you can see on the picture on your left there, anytime you see a lot of exposed rock like that, that's erosion issues. And lots of times in the hill country, you see a lot of exposed rock. It usually means, you know, it's been overgrazed by goats and stuff. But you can see there that we're having a lot of drainage coming off of this hill. So what we decided to do with volunteers, and volunteers, by the way, I could not do this work without volunteers. They're just worth their weight in gold. We took some of those down logs and started putting them perpendicular across the slope. And you can see kind of the depth of this. We cut some of the lower branches, the dead branches off of juniper, and made brush berms out of that, and then took the down oak from almost 40 years ago now, and laid it perpendicular across the slope. And then we added organic matter and leaves and compost, sheet mulching this area. And then the final touches, you see the cages there, we're adding lots of understory plants, again, to increase the diversity for things like butterflies and moths and birds. You know, you're not going to have birds unless you have butterflies or caterpillars. So, and spider habitat and all of that. So the whole idea is to get these areas to begin to sing again and not just be silent. One of the things we do with some of the invasive species like ligustrum is we'll cut the ligustrum down and then we'll inoculate it with turkey-tail mycelium. And here's a group of folks doing that. We train a lot of people to do this as well. And it's basically getting a log, drilling a hole in it, and then we have these bags of turkey-tail mycelium that we have collected off the preserve, so it's hyper-local. And we have a grower who grows it out for us and sends it back to us. And then we stuff those little holes with that mycelium. Sometimes we'll put a little wax covering over it to protect it from a passing beetle or something who wants to eat it. And so you can see this group here inoculating those logs. And then we'll put them out on the landscape for erosion control and things like that. And then we'll have, that's turkey tail on the far right there. It's medicinal. You can take it and make either a tincture out of it. They sell that. It's supposed to be really good as a boost your immune system, antiviral, antibacteria type thing, and anti-tumor, according to some Japanese studies. So it's a really great mushroom. And about a year or two afterwards, you come back to those inoculated mushroom logs, and you can just break it up in your hand, and then it becomes a mulch for us. So we're taking something that's a bit of a problem, invasive species, and turning it into a mulch. And here's one of the larger logs fruiting out with turkey tail. And about a year from that now, that thing will just be mulch, and we'll use it as a ground cover. Turkey tail again. So the whole idea, the stuff that we're doing there is really all about building community. I can't do this work by myself, and it's, you know, we have, you know, a lot of acres out there that need some attention. And so the education component is wonderful. And this is where our outreach team comes in and is really helpful. The goal of our restoration work is to share best practices and build a community of trained volunteers who can join us on the BCP to enhance and restore functional ecosystems from the ground up. It's important to do this work for our endangered species, but it's equally important to educate the Austin community about the value of these preserve systems and how we can bring some of these degraded areas back to life. And again, as many of you know who walk the Barton Creek green belts and other areas, we have beautiful, beautiful land, and it's one of those things that it's gold that we got that thing set aside. 30,000 acres in Western Travis County. Anyway, so this is my contact information. If you would like to contact me with a question or comments or whatever. I am in the field pretty much 7 days a week now, pretty long hours. So I apologize ahead of time if I don't get back to you quickly. I'll eventually get there, but I spend a lot of time out planting trees and doing work right now. We're a little short-handed because of the pandemic issues, so it just kind of doubles my workload a little bit. So, and that butterfly is a zebra wing butterfly, and its host plant is passion flower. And so we want to make sure we have plenty of passion flower in our system as well. So with that, I will stop and take any questions that you might have.
All right, Jim, thanks for that great presentation. We do have a couple of questions.
Okay, I'm going to get back to our. Sure, hold on one second. I'm just going to get back to my contact information here real quick.
Oh, sure, yeah. We'll leave that up while we do Q&A. But I'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah, go ahead and get started. Sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me pull up the chat box real quick. So the first question that we have in the Q&A box is, how do you design the bioswales?
That's a great question, and carefully. You know, we actually put those in about once a year because there's a lot of preliminary work and thought that goes into that. Funding is certainly one of them, but we look at areas that have been degraded for a long period of time. So there's certain criteria that we're looking at. We also do biological surveys to make sure that there's nothing sensitive in those areas that we would be disrupting or taking out. We do a lot of work on, you know, looking at the soil, because we certainly don't want to hire our contractor to go in there and always pulling out a bunch of boulders. So we do soil tests to make sure that the soil is something that we can dig up, and it's not too rocky, that type of stuff. We're also looking at drainage. We're also looking at the least amount of trees that might be altered because of it. The ideal situation is we don't take out any trees at all and we just trim. And we did a lot of that. We're working on one right now where it's maybe 800-900 feet long. And I think we took out 14 small, little tiny junipers, the small ones. And then we trimmed up just so we could get that bioswale in there. But we're going to add over 500 trees of lots of diversity into that system. So, so to make that decision, it's a careful decision. We want to also, if we can get water draining off of a road into that system, so it doesn't, keep, eroding our dirt road, so to speak, that's a plus for us. We're real careful with oak wilt issues. There's a lot that goes into a lot of planning and talking, but it has to be on contour, or should be on contour. If it's a little slightly off contour, we can deal with it with little check dams and things. But so you're looking for areas that are on contour, high in the landscape, that collect water before it rushes down hills and cause problems down the way. So anyway, it's a lengthy process with a lot of thought. We usually start by drawing it out on maps, on contour maps and things.
All right, great. And the next question we have was kind of the first, it's a two-part question. The first part was just answered in that explanation. Okay. But the second part is they're wondering how if you put in a bioswale, how far out does the improvement extend?
Farther than I thought. The one at the Vireo Preserve, we put it there because it's right above an older growth endangered species habitat. The trees just down slope there are probably a couple of 100 years old. And so we didn't want to do anything, flooding. I mean, the area above it was flat caliche, or it was not really flat. It had an angle, but it was a flooding issue, seed erosion. We didn't want to do anything to compromise those older trees down the way. So we put 3 bioswales across that slope, and it has filled in all the way in between each one of those, with vegetation that wasn't there before. Some of that we seeded, some of it just came up on its own, and I'm sure it's some birds dispersing, or maybe a little bit of a seed bank that may have been left in that situation. But we're exploring that, and I think as the soil biology improves and it becomes, the structure improves, and it's able to hold more water, and then it's able to allow water to move down below it. And I understand from other people who have done this kind of work, it takes about 7 years for the soil to improve to the point where it's called a mature berm. And then water not only percolates through the berm, but then just down slope as well. And the idea, which I think is real interesting because of our, when you dig in that soil, you hit that really hard rock, limestone. Well, that water is just going to, at that point, move on down and then pop out, hopefully, as a little spring that will irrigate another feature down the way.
Okay, great, thanks. Next question. When you make the bioswales, do you use any stone aggregate or modified soil? Is there any check dams?
Yeah, check dams. Oh yeah, we definitely do check dams occasionally. The contractor that we deal with makes those pretty level, so we haven't had to do many check dams. A check dam, for what I'm referring to there, is if, say, like the swale's not totally level, and we don't want that water rushing anywhere. So if there's an area that's not quite level and water might flow at a faster pace than we want, then we'll build a little rock check dam to slow that water, hold that water in that spot until it can soak in. I don't really bring in rock for that system. I bring in rock for erosion control, which is off the preserve. They're doing a cave dig now, so I'm getting a bunch of rock from that. And as far as bringing in soil, we do bring in a little bit of soil, sometimes mainly just to keep, if you just got caliche, which is subsoil, and if we break that up a little bit to kind of break that surface tension, we'll sometimes add in a little bit of soil, but we're talking a small amount because I have to haul it all in there. It's a really thin covering of soil, and it's great for starting seeds and stuff, because it's going to, you got a substrate there that roots are going to be able to take off a little bit on, and then we'll cover it with mulch, and then get our stuff to sprout out and everything. But the inputs, yeah, I mean, I definitely bring compost in there, and I bring a small amount of soil. We also make our own compost, but we don't have a big enough operation to do what we do. Compost is great. I mean, because there's basically no nutrients in our soil in those areas. I call it cottage cheese. It's just white stuff. And again, I'm talking about the most degraded areas of our preserve, not the more typical stuff. And so compost is a huge benefit for that. Quality of the compost is important, but in my case, I'm just looking for a nitrogen source that can, break down some of the, the carbon matter and stuff. So anyway, So yes, we do bring in a few things.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Mhm.
Next question, how do I get assistance from the county or other for restoration plans or projects? I have a mountain and designated preserve area under our HOA purview in Lakeway. We're just above the BCP and the Colorado River.
I don't really have an answer to that. We get our funding. I guess the only thing I can think of is some grant funding of some sort. I know the General Land Office has money for erosion control, and I'm told they have like $1 billion or so in the state of Texas, specifically for rainwater catchment and erosion control type issues. That sounds daunting to try to go that direction, but I would like to find a way that this is easier and more people could afford to do this. And right now it's just sort of done with, the funding that we secure through, places like the Urban Forest Fund and things like that. So yeah, I don't have a really good answer for that. I wish I did.
Thanks, Jim. Next question, what does your treatment of seed entail?
Yeah. So sometimes it varies. So sometimes the most extreme one that we do is usually the ones that have fruit around it, because it usually has to go through the gut of an animal, right? Going through, an acid treatment basically. And so on those seeds, we have a guy who helps us to prepare those seeds. Jill Noakes's book is probably a good source for that. He uses like sulfuric acid for 15 seconds and then 25 seconds on the stuff I'm using right now. We didn't really want to go that route. Personally, I didn't want to deal with sulfuric acid, but he does, and he treats those. And then he stratifies them, which means basically putting them in a refrigerator for 30 to 90 days, that type of thing, to mimic kind of an awesome winter. So that's the more extreme type stuff. We have done stuff just so that you don't want to do that route, like with evergreen sumac seeds and evergreen and flame leaf sumac seeds. They produce so much seed sometimes. You just, you take them, you dry them out a little bit, and then you just scatter them and make sure they make good soil contact and kind of push them in a little bit. And you're going to get something from that, because you're actually putting out hundreds and hundreds of seeds, and you're going to get something. And that's the way I used to do it. And I've got areas that are full of those areas because of doing of those plants because of that. Things like acorns, and you can just get those in the ground like as soon as possible. You don't want to store acorns in the refrigerator. You get an acorn, it's like the next day. If you can plant that acorn, the better, because the longer it's not in the ground, it loses viability quickly. And so you want to get those in the ground pretty quick. Things like Carolina buckthorn does have a fruit around it, but it's almost 100% germination. It's a really easy one to germinate. You just get that in the ground. It's a little forest plant. Lots of times with these seeds, we just gather them and then we just get them in the ground. That's kind of the easiest way to do that. And then sometimes just mass plantings, but oaks are probably the easiest thing to grow, especially Quercus bucklei, the Texas red oak. That like has 100% germination, but you got to get it in the ground. You got to get it in the ground where it's got some cover too, some little protection from that afternoon sun. Anyway, there's a whole class probably and a whole thing to teach on it, but I would recommend Jill Noakes's book on growing native plants.
Okay, thank you. And so next question. So this question asks, what are the 10 best small woody plants for restoration? Or maybe if you have like a top 5 small woody plants that you prefer.
Oh yeah, so just like restoration in those caliche areas. Yeah, so we use a lot of legume type things. The one that's probably a bulletproof guy that works every time for me is Mimosa borealis. It is also called fragrant mimosa. It's great. You can put that in the ground and basically almost never water it. It's a legume. The issue is that it's really thorny and it will cut you up, and it has a beautiful shape where it kind of flows up and out, and the flowers are pretty. But on a windy day when those little limbs are bouncing around, if you're too close, it will cut you, this thorny thing. But I love the plant, but I do get cut on it a lot. So so there's that. Flame leaf sumac is another good one because it actually kind of suckers a little bit too, which, you know, I'm trying to add as many, trying to increase the biomass in those areas to create shade and organic matter and biomass. So flame leaf sumac and evergreen sumac, if you have good drainage. Now all these things require good drainage. And so when I'm looking at the landscape, sometimes though I see a lot of seat muley, which is a grass that grows in kind of wet areas, or something like bushy blue stem or something. That's an area probably I wouldn't plant a woody plant in, because it's probably going to, it's a moist area, which is good, but I suspect in a lot of our caliche soil, the drainage is kind of poor. So if you plant in those areas, especially evergreen sumac is susceptible to root rot. So you want an area that's really got good drainage, but once that plant is established, it's tough out there. It's a good drought resistant plant, evergreen sumac. Let's see, what else do we put out there? We do a little bit with a weesach, just because it's a tough guy and it kind of comes up on its own. They don't plant a lot of it because of the size of that thorn, and I don't really want it suckering too much and too far. So those are good. Trying to think what else. Let's see. You know, we do a lot of herbaceous type stuff too, like goldeneye and anything that will be fairly aggressive out there. I don't mind aggressive in those early stages because we want plant cover as quickly as possible so that we can get other things, oaks and cherries and stuff established as well. So anyway, I would definitely, kidney wood, if I didn't mention that, kidney wood's wonderful. It doesn't have thorns, and it's not as tough as Mimosa borealis, but it's right up there with it, and it's a great pollinator plant. In the fall, especially, it attracts bees and butterflies and all sorts of stuff. So, kidney wood, you just can't get enough kidney wood. Anyway.
Great. So next question: do you have any suggestions for someone who's lost several feet of soil depth due to headwater running into their yard? Would you suggest building some berms, or have any advice for that?
Yeah, I kind of have to see it, I guess. You know, so you've got, is it like it's a head cut in your yard, I guess is what he's referring to. And, you know, I don't really know how to address that without looking at it. The head cuts that we deal with on the preserve, we armor those things. So you have to kind of cut into it, smooth it out a little bit, and then you put rock in it to armor it up so you don't lose any more soil, and then have a place for the water to be diverted to, so that it doesn't keep just cutting stuff. The other issue is you can just fill it in and then build a rock berm to divert water, you know, to make sure that it doesn't come back into that system again. But I guess the first thing I do is look at why that came into your yard and try to fix it up slope from that, to make sure that it doesn't continue. But the issue with head cuts is they don't really go away unless you address them, because they just keep progressing uphill and getting deeper and wider and that type of thing. So it's something to address, but I really can't without seeing what the issue is. But anyway.
All right, and I think we're gonna go ahead and we'll do one more question. Can you use prairie grass hay for a bioswale?
Prairie grass hay. Yeah, I mean, I would use it as a mulch on a bioswale. If you're thinking about doing a bioswale in a grassland situation, certainly it can be done. The thing about, you know, those bioswales is, you know, and And if you're local here, as soon as we get volunteers back, I love talking about this stuff and giving tours and stuff out there. So come out and see us, and I can show you this. But on our bioswales, every one of them have, you know, a way for water to get out, a spillway. And so the spillway is usually in between two berms, and there's an area where in case of a 10-inch rain, we don't want that water going over the bioswale. And the nice thing about trees is they hold that bioswale with the root system. Grasses, you know, you can get some pretty deep roots in that stuff, and, you know, in the thing too, but they're really designed for trees. But if you do grass, just make sure that you've got a spillway that in the event of a heavy flooding event, that water is not going over the berms, it's being diverted, you know, down someplace else where it won't cause problems. But yeah, I would use it as a mulch in a second. So.
Right, great. Thanks so much, Jim. That's all the time we have for questions.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much for presenting for us, and we really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks so much.